I'm David Levy. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and I'm really grateful to Mark and the BBC for hosting us here tonight, and to Zillah for creating the report, which is the reason why we're all here. First, a word about the Reuters Institute for those of you who don't know us. We're a small research institute based in Oxford. We combine research with our fellowship program, which has brought about 600 journalists to Oxford over the last 30-odd years for a period of research, reflection, and exchange of ideas about journalism. Some of our current journalist fellows are here tonight in the audience. And we've had quite a lot of journalists from the BBC with us over the last few years, and that's organised, the BBC Fellowship's organised with us through the BBC Academy as well. You probably know us best for our annual digital news report, which is led by Nick Newman, and which has become the go-to place for people who want to find out what's happening in terms of news consumption across the world. In 2016, it looked at 26 countries. In 2017, it's going to look at 36 countries. We're going to publish that on June the 22nd. And we're delighted that we've had support on that from the BBC since its inception in 2012, and from Google since 2013, along with many, many other people, many other sponsors involved in that. The digital news report's part of our larger digital news project, supported by Google, which includes a whole range of publications. We've looked recently at issues such as the use of metrics in the newsroom, online video, and Nick does another annual publication for us because he doesn't want to have a quiet Christmas, which is his Trends and Predictions publication, which is published in January, just after the start of the new year. Our mission really is to try and connect research with practice, and as part of that we're really pleased when we can engage and persuade practitioners to come and work with us. A while ago last year, Andrew Jack from the FT spent a bit of time with us doing a report for us on the pitfalls and opportunities of editorial email newsletters, and Zillah's report really fits in to the model of bringing practitioner insights into our research. And as Zillah has done, those reports draw on the insights from multiple organizations and to share the ideas from that and contribute to our research. We're really pleased to the BBC for releasing Zillah to do this work with us, and to Zillah for doing a great report that's attracted a huge amount of attention in the industry, and which I'm sure is going to be a lot of interest to you tonight. So, what's going to happen now? I'm going to ask Zillah to come and present the report. She's going to do that for about 20 minutes. Then Nick is going to chair a panel with Zillah and some other people on the panel who are listed here, who Nick will introduce you to when he chairs the panel, and there'll be a panel discussion with them and with Zillah. Then there's questions and answers with all of you. Then we finish, and then there's drinks. So, thank you very much. Thanks for coming along. And Zillah, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. So my report aimed to give a snapshot of what's going on in VR news in 2017. But bravely, I stepped outside the BBC and looked at what other organisations are doing, because the last 2 years I've been developing early VR experiments in editorial storytelling for VR, and it was a really welcome experience to go and see what other people are doing and to meet some incredibly inspiring people who are battling with emerging technology to produce great content for audiences. So tonight I'm going to briefly take you through some of the key findings. First of all, back 2 years ago, when World Affairs correspondent Paul Adams and I went to film at the Calais migrant camp in June 2015, VR for news seemed very far-fetched indeed. But the technology and the understanding of how to produce VR content has developed at an incredible pace. And when Google launched their Daydream headset and platform in November 2016, it included lots of news brands, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and CNN, to name just a few. And they had Daydream apps. And significantly, they were promoted alongside games. VR had come out of the labs and into the newsroom. And the New York Times has been leading the way. The New York Times is doing this at 2 levels. They've got the high-end VR app that's designed for, where's my cardboard, viewing through Google Cardboard. Those are longer documentary-style pieces, more expensive to produce, more longevity in terms of the content because of that. And they're produced in association with The Weekend magazine, which promotes them heavily when it releases the content. Good for the weekend when you've got time to watch it. And in November 2016, they launched a daily 360 report with the aim of getting more people used to the idea of VR and creating a daily viewing habit. And the Daily 360 is prominently displayed on the news app and on their homepage. That's a screen grab from my phone app from yesterday. So here's some examples from the Daily 360 of the huge variety of content that they're publishing, which explores every section of the newspaper. It's not just news, but it does include 360 reporting, such as the Fukushima piece there that you can see in the top left-hand corner. Now, that takes you right into the exclusion zone, so you can look around and see for yourself a place frozen in time, houses people left with beds unmade and washing up half done. Creating daily 360 content of this quality should be celebrated as both a creative and organizational feat. It's delivered by a multidisciplinary team who provide the specialist skills to commission, edit, and publish 360. They provide a strong editorial vision and quality control, but they've also trained over 100 journalists in the New York Times how to shoot 360. And some say that photojournalists have a natural eye for 360 and might find it easier than video journalists. A similar model is being adopted in other news organizations, such as the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and USA Today. So let's just step back for a minute and see the range of experiences available to consumers via the different sorts of headsets available, because that's really key to understanding where different news organizations are positioning themselves in VR. At the very bottom level, there is 360 video, which you can view on a browser on your computer or on a smartphone as a magic window like this. I wouldn't call that VR. It becomes VR when you view it through a headset. And then there are different levels of VR viewing, from just watching it on your phone through cardboard like this, through to the next stage up, which is a mobile VR headset, which might have a controller and be far more immersive, right up to the top with the sort of proper gaming-style consoles, the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive. Nobody thinks people are going to buy those for news. You'd expect journalists to be skeptical about that, and they are. The big bet for news is on mobile VR developing, and that's what people are aiming towards. But at the moment, most news organizations are actually mostly producing 360 video. It's often said that 360 video is a gateway to VR. But is it? We don't really know. Does watching something on a phone make you want to get one of these and get from there to there? 360 video is certainly a gateway to VR production, especially now low-end consumer cameras are becoming available. And that's one of the things that's really helped VR news to push forward by reducing production costs and by allowing the fast turnarounds required by news. Indeed, 360 news is now becoming very good, so good, arguably, it might just become a very useful tool in the visual toolkit, in the visual journalism toolkit, and just remain 360 video. But that wouldn't drive forward VR and headset uptake. And that's one of the issues we're grappling with at the moment. So for the organizations that have gone into VR, I asked them all what were their motivations for getting into VR so early. And for many, including The Guardian, Blick, newspaper in Switzerland, and ARTE, it was demonstrating that they were innovative. It was very important to them. It's in their lifeblood, and very important for the brand credentials of a number of newspapers and broadcasting organizations. Also there was excitement about 360, the possibility of telling stories in completely new ways that really did enable people to feel that they were there and enjoy presence in the story has really excited journalists. So journalistic curiosity in itself has helped push forward VR. And further to that, being part of a new medium and the excitement of helping develop that has been very important. From more biz dev people, obviously, being there at the start to create relationships with tech companies has been very important in the tech platforms, and exploring early monetization models. But with this technology evolving so fast, is it too early for news to be going into VR? Sometimes in the media there is a compulsion to innovate for the sake of it, and it's not clear there's first mover advantage at this early stage of VR development. It's something we can discuss later. While continuing occasional experiments, a number of the organizations I spoke to have decided not to prioritize VR for now, but they were almost embarrassed to tell me that because there is such a compulsion on being shown to have done stuff and be moving forward. So slightly smaller publicly funded broadcasters like VRT in Belgium and RTS in Switzerland said they've been experimenting with VR, will continue to do so, but their digital priorities right now must be based on audience needs. And the Digital Production Partnership also backs this view for broadcasters. They say there's time, and you can wait till the technology matures, and that gaming and training are the more obvious first user cases for VR. So I really wanted to represent those viewpoints in this report too. For TV, the priority should be UHD production, they say. And lots of technical development is still required before it's really sensible for broadcasters to enter into virtual reality big time. For that reason, in any organization, a contained approach is probably the most sensible way to move forward right now. After all, there's no real audience yet, because very few people have headsets. So let's take a look at the current predictions for headset uptake. Now, you've probably read all sorts of wild speculations about how quickly it is going to be before lots of people have headsets in the home. So BBC Strategy took a look at the way those calculations are made and came up with a slightly more conservative estimate. It's all based on data, based on uptake of technology in the past, be it gaming consoles or smartphones. And you can get very different growth curves depending on what you base it on. But on this sort of prediction, which is slightly conservative, it's going to be about 2022 before there's a significant number of adults in the population who have reasonably good headsets. And no one I spoke to in news organizations was unrealistic about this. They all saw it as a long-term game, but one they could learn through. And if they got the right teams together to solve this challenge, they'd be ready to solve any future challenges. As I said before, for news, in most organizations, the bet is very firmly on mobile VR being the thing that takes off and leads to further consumption. And there's a great hope that convergence will ultimately lead these to be very powerful indeed. So we'll be able to do very cool and impressive VR experiences on them. So for the news organizations that have moved VR into production and published apps and are regularly publishing content, this is the sort of thing they've got to so far. They've got a content strategy, they've got a means to produce or commission that content. Most people are doing it in-house as much as possible to save costs at the moment because it gets very expensive otherwise. A content distribution strategy, and you can see that these are all interconnected and very hard to separate. Your distribution will affect very much the content you choose to create. And a strong editorial and marketing strategy to raise awareness of the VR, both with audiences and within the industry. And an early business strategy, starting to think about how VR is going to bring in money. So I'll touch on some of these things as I move forward, but let's first start on some of the motivations for early for the real challenge you have in terms of content strategy. So it's basically, you've got a decision to make between quality and reach. If you go for quality, which The Guardian have done, you've got high-end VR experiences accessible through a headset. You're not going to get it to as many people. If you go for reach, you're going for bigger audiences via YouTube or a 360 player, but you're not giving people a taste of the real power of VR, and it may not be distinctive enough. I looked at what made a good VR story, and the best conclusion I came to was one from Mark Young-Nickel from Built, who just said, it's as simple as this: be them or be there. Be them is fly down a cliff with someone, fly with a fighter pilot over the Alps. Be there is a sense of presence in a unique location, which includes foreign reporting. And we've seen lots of interesting foreign reports over the last year, very different from TV news in terms of their approach. They help you understand stories in a different way, look around, see for yourself what it's like there. But we're also seeing, as VR evolves, some incredibly powerful stories that are beyond, I think, what was originally thought about for news, which was empathy and helping you understand how people lived in the world. We're seeing stories that bring wonder and awe and take you to places like Pluto that you couldn't otherwise go, or help you understand what it's like to be blind, or fly with a fighter pilot, or climb into someone's brain and see what happens to their neurons if they've got Alzheimer's, which is a very strong piece that Associated Press does. So VR isn't all about empathy for news, and that may have been slightly distorting in the earlier days of just a couple of years ago, when lots of people were doing quite difficult subjects. Now it's about creating bundles of content, which might include some serious reporting and foreign reporting, but lots of awe and wonder as well. Marketing and comms, as I said before, incredibly important. The Guardian have been very clever about this. Even if you haven't watched The Guardian's VR, you'll probably know they're doing VR. They've taken it out to audiences in festivals. They've taken it to the White House to show it there at events. They've commissioned content around the piece so that everyone becomes aware of it. A fewer, bigger, better approach would definitely create more impact. And here's Blix, a Swiss newspaper, handing out VR headsets at Swiss railway stations, creating a special edition for VR, and then continuing to talk about VR week after week to ensure that they grow audiences for their VR app. News organizations are also doing a great deal to explain about VR to audiences, and they're having to tell people how to download apps, about the various different possibilities. It's complex stuff, but absolutely necessary if you're going to VR at this early stage. So I'd like to turn briefly, and again we'll discuss this more with Nick in a moment, to early business models. Nobody has the answer yet, and this is a very experimental part of VR news. You can't do VR without tech partnerships if you want people to view your content on headsets. The New York Times VR app launch was in partnership with Google to provide over 1 million cardboard headsets to subscribers, and The Guardian, Blick, and others have followed this model too. But tech platforms are also helping to seed fund some early content. Samson has partnered with a number of news organizations, including the New York Times. That's the partnership behind the Daily 360, and Euronews also to develop early 360 news content. Does this raise risks to the independence of news? It's certainly something that news needs to be very aware of. But the biggest risk is that the funding is short-term, and therefore the future of news rests on longer-term monetization plans. And again, that's all highly experimental. And rather ironic that the new medium of VR is returning to the model Westinghouse exploited to create content to drive the early radio industry in the US in the 20s. And the aim here, you see some of the early branded content that some organizations have started to produce. Their aim isn't just to publish branded content, it's also to make it. So we're seeing branded content studios springing up in news organizations. For example, in USA Today, the New York Times, and Blick in Switzerland. So the other highly experimental area and slightly forgotten part of all this is perhaps audiences. And that's the weakest area of understanding and the least research aspect of this. When I asked one VR news editor who the current audience VR news is, he joked VR news producers. And it's not that far from the truth. And in particular, greater understanding is needed as to how VR works in the home. So BBC Marketing and Audiences and Ipsos Mori recently conducted a longitudinal ethnographic research to understand the consumption of VR in the home. And they gave 16 households VR headsets to explore. And they'll be running proper debriefs on that soon. But the research suggests there were some considerable limitations to current mobile VR experiences. Clunky user experience on the headsets, they're not that great yet. Confusion around varying user experiences for different apps. Content discovery was a particular issue. Finding good VR is kind of like being given a pile of CDs without labels on and being told to find something good to listen to. So we definitely need more intelligent curation of content around audience needs. Another recent study, which actually involves some BBC content, indicates that even the furniture we sit on impacts on our VR experience. Sofas don't make it easy to look around. So unless we redesign the home, maybe 180 VR content in a headset might be the future for some things. All this suggests the technology is going to need some time to bed down, and that the next generation may be the true beneficiaries of today's experiments. So, what do we need to make VR work for audiences? We need much better content. It needs to continue to improve, and we need more of it. We need advances in production technology to make it easier and bring down costs. We need better consumer technology so that their experience at home is frictionless, and lots of understanding of audiences. And to do this, news organizations need to work together. Without that, we can't come together and understand and create a frictionless user experience for audiences and create a united front when lobbying the tech platforms about what's required to do that from a news standpoint. So despite all these challenges, I'd like to end on a positive note. Good VR is amazing. It can make you quake with fear, make you laugh with joy, or make you cry. And bringing the power of this new medium into the home is worth the fight. And it's going to have many applications important to our lives beyond entertainment. The recently formed BAFTA advisory group has selected some of the most creative and groundbreaking VR content from cinematic VR through to games for 2017. And I can give you a sneaky preview. So sit back and enjoy. And remember, this is just the beginning.
Thank you. That was amazing. Some fantastic VR content and also fantastic report. If you haven't read it, do download it from the Reuters Institute website or just Google it. VR for News, the New Reality. And I think what's really impressive is that it provides a really balanced picture of what's going on, some fantastic examples, but also is very clear about some of the practical obstacles that we've all got to go through. So I'm Nick Newman, I'm from the Reuters Institute, and on the panel, as well as Zillah, we have from The Guardian, we have Anna Bateson, who's Vice President of Platforms and Partnerships, and responsible for the deals with VR with Facebook and Google, and also wider commercial aspects of The Guardian's video strategy, and has also worked on the platform side with YouTube and Google for 7 years, so we'll be talking about that, I'm sure. And then also sitting next to me, I've got Kay Meseberg, who leads 360 VR innovation at ARTE, the European Cultural Transmedia Cultural Network, and you saw some of Kay's commissions and work in the presentation, which have won a number of awards, and Kay personally has won awards for his personal work and for some of the commissions. So it's a fantastic panel to take on, hopefully, some of the stuff that Zillah's been talking about. So I maybe just open up with some sort of reactions and thoughts from both of you. I mean, I think my sort of takeaway is amazing stuff, amazing potential, but actually a huge amount still needs to be done on the technology, on audiences, on business models. It may take a very long time. Is that how you see it? Do we just need to reset our expectations? Is there too much hype? I mean, what do we think in terms of the overall story? Anna, maybe to kick off.
Well, I agree with Zillah, which is very boring to say, but I do really agree with her.
I was really hoping for some disagreement.
Really agree with Zillah. I think essentially it is exciting, because I think when you see great VR, you realise that there is genuinely that sort of kind of tantalising sense of something being very profoundly interesting when it's used in the right way. There is also a very, very long way to go, but that doesn't mean that finding ways to experiment in the now isn't something that's very valuable. I think the risk is, which you do talk about, I think very eloquently, is that by going in too much and by making bad content, you kill the whole thing. Because I do think it's a disillusioning. If you've done all that work to get a cardboard or a headset into somebody's hands, and they try it and they watch something and it's sort of miserable and unimpressive, it's very difficult to imagine why they're going to go back. And so I do think there's the risk of you kill it with too much hype and then just too much bad content. So I do think there's a premium on maybe less and making it as good as it can possibly be.
That's kind of your strategy, really. But at the same time, you've got the immediate opportunity of sort of 360 and some of these other opportunities which are here now. So it's a kind of difficult balance, isn't it? Difficult time, Kay.
It's an interesting time.
Interesting.
If you look back in media history, radio took 75 years to reach 50 million listeners.
Yeah.
TV was something like 50 years, something like that. And we are in VR now since 5 years, since Polar C360.
But we're just impatient, right? I mean, we're conditioned with a smartphone. We just expect things to take off in very short periods of time, and everything gets shorter.
But you see a million views on a video, a 360 video on Facebook or YouTube or something like that. So it's a bit a question of how to balance and what to say is a lot or not. I think we really. I'm with you saying that less is more. But it was really interesting to see at ARTE that the most successful launch of an app was the VR and the 360. Well, the first 360 ARTE 360 app. Same like for the New York Times back in the days, which is now 2 years ago, I think. That's extremely promising as a new medium. But on the other hand, still and there I think less is more is really the good focus on it. Is we are working on something which is a dream that filmmakers have since the Lumiere brothers started doing cinema. Eisenstein was working on it, and all these people, and you had the first 360 animations, not animations back in the days, but the first 360 cinemas already more than 100 years ago. And even the BBC had an interesting prototype of what let's say a room where you watch TV now would look like in the future, and it was actually something we can say now is a sort of VR without having goggles.
Yeah.
So a projection in a dome where you are in a theater, in a movie, or in a stadium of a football game. So that is extremely important, I think, to take into account that actually we're working now on something where technology helps us as people commissioning content, working on content, are with it.
And have we got to the stage, so we get really excited about these possibilities and about the new technology, but we've also got to, Zillah was making the point, Anna, we've also got to think about the audiences in this as well. And maybe, once we've got through this early stage of being really excited about it, maybe now is the time to start thinking more about audiences and working with audiences and what works.
Well, I thought that's a really good point, because one thing is content and quality of content. The other is the quality of the experience. And I think that your point about actually sitting on a sofa in a domestic environment isn't often the best way to see the experiences. And when you work with people who've shown lots of, we did an event with Google, and they very kindly produced the event, and they'd done a lot of demonstrating of VR because they demonstrate their Daydream phones and headsets a lot. And their understanding about how you make it a brilliant experience for people is really sophisticated. You need space, you need rotating chairs, you can't bash into each other, you need to think about the sound. You also need to think about scheduling people to have the experience. And I was talking to Fran, who's taken a lot of our VR pieces to festivals, and how wrong if you think about how carefully people treat film, and you think about cinemas and beautiful cinemas and the comfort of the chairs and the audio, and we're so far from that with how you actually expose people, even in curated environments, to VR. So I do think that whole sort of sense of the early experiences need to be really considered, and you can't rush out to mass, because in a sense you're just going to you will massively under-deliver, and you will get to many people, but actually to what end? And I do think you need to think more carefully about how people begin to understand VR and build from small out, really.
And I mean, part of the problem of doing that, Zillah, is the fragmented nature that you set out in the presentation, is that there's so many different types of VR, there are so many platforms, there are so many different kinds of headsets, and they all require slightly different things. One might be fine with a sofa, and one might not be. Do you think that needs to come together before everything takes off, or is it fine to have this fragmented environment with lots of experimentation?
It's fine for experimentation, but at the moment you've got to completely rebuild your VR piece for every single platform, and that's untenable. It's far more complicated than ever we think when we start. Each one we think, it's not going to take that long, and always raises huge numbers of difficulties. So
just
those
practically
things,
expense.
It's expensive. It's trial and error. You're trying to, because especially if you're trying to make really high quality experiences that push a little bit what you can do with this, with each one, you're struggling to get it working as well as it needs to be. They've all got different forms of interactivity that you've got to deal with. If you're just using gaze interaction to look around with your eyes, you don't want to make people's heads ache and necks ache, so you have to limit it. Whereas if you've got a controller, you can obviously do much.
So practically, how does that work? So maybe we'll talk to both of you about this. But Anna, first, say you did the 6x9, the Cell VR for the Guardian. I mean, how many different versions of that did you have to do? How much did it cost?
No, I think we only made. I don't know. Maybe we made 2. As in, you could watch it in cardboard and you could watch it with gear.
Right. So you basically went for the 2 most popular platforms for that kind of content.
But this is a major challenge, that now, because we're in partnership with Google, we're producing pieces for Daydream, which are highly rendered and complicated, and we do have ambitions to convert them so that they would then be available on all platforms, but we're struggling with that, either because it's actually not possible, because we made them too complicated at the beginning, or because it's just too expensive. And we did also have these ambitions that we would create these pieces, and then we would version them and make them sort of agnostically available within our app, and then we would build up a sort of significant audience for our app through that, and then that would become something valuable, because you'd have a platform that you could host other content in. And I think we're rather a long way away from that.
Okay, what's your experience of versioning for multiple platforms? I mean, how do you look at this problem?
First, we do a versioning of offline and online, so to say. So offline means we are working with planetariums, with cinemas, festivals for different occasions. to do demos and to show things there, but also in dome cinemas, where you have a 240-degree screen, which is extremely interesting because it's you watch VR content without porting a goggle, and you are together with 200 or 300 people. That's really amazing.
Again, a completely different experience.
And a completely different experience, yeah, indeed. And then, of course, online, where the idea is that we kind of author the content for the different kind of vectors where we publish it in a different manner. Working on that, it works pretty well with video-based content, obviously. But then, based on metadata, we can add things to it. We can force perspectives. We can do things.
But just more complication and more cost every single platform or version you're trying to do, right?
Yeah, well, that's a game. But the idea is really to have a tool that allows us really to adapt the content to the different.
So that's another of the things that needs to be in place, I suppose. So we're kind of getting on to platforms. So it's expensive. So this is one of the reasons, presumably, that Zillah mentioned it in the presentation. We have to partner with people, and you're partnering with Google, so that's a choice, right? So are they effectively paying for your VR studio? Is that essentially, are they essentially funding your experimentation?
Yes.
That's a good business for you, right?
No, it's not a good business.
Okay, it doesn't make money.
It's funding. No, it doesn't make any money, but it is funding experimentation, which is a wonderful thing. And I think that's one of the reasons, I don't think any news organization is enjoying a time of pomp and splendor at the moment.
Right.
And I think one of the perpetual challenges within a time where people are looking to be more efficient and cut costs and sort of adapt to a new world, one of the challenges is how at the same time do you still enable experimentation, and do you still allow people to kind of try new technologies and try and take news forwards? And I think that the partnership with Google and the partnership with other platforms who are willing to kind of try and finance the best in content and try and drive experimentation as what's going to unlock the magic in that content is it's a wonderful thing. And I think that if you, I don't know if it's in your report where you point out that it was, Gates who originally said, that in the end, you're nothing, content's king, and you're nothing if when people use technology you can't find great things at it, and sometimes you have to help that process forwards.
And this is moving all the time, isn't it? So we've got Google, we've got Samsung, and Facebook, of course, coming in this last week, was it, Zillah? With 50 million for news specifically, or for information, non-gaming stuff, basically?
Non-gaming, story-led. Content.
So that's quite significant. That's another pot of money that previously they were making content that now is going out to the industry for you to bid for, presumably. Is that? Are you looking? How do you get funding for what you do?
Yeah, it's we look into it like more the classical way in terms of co-production. That someone like the Oculus Studio is co-funding or co-producing an experience which is coming out in June, I think, Alteration. And things like that. So it's a co-production scenario where you have a part which is coming from ARTE, another one from other parties.
So it's a bit like big dramas that the BBC might do, where you need to do it years in advance and think about it and think about all your different partners. But then how does that work with news, Zillah?
I don't think. Well, it depends what type of news. If you're doing, fast turnaround news reporting, that's less expensive to produce because generally that's being done with consumer cameras. So the New York Times Daily 360 is done with the Samsung camera. That's how they achieve it. So I think that's a sort of different end of the spectrum. But if you're doing high-end content for news, for example, the New York Times app, some of that content would be of that model.
Yeah, I'm going to open it up in a minute for questions. Sorry, Anna.
No, I was going to say the other piece of it is foundations, and particularly people who are interested in furthering understanding around issues, which I think is beginning to sort of, and that's much less about reach, and it's much more about the right people experiencing something in the right way. And that's one of the things that we sort of, again, slightly stumbled upon with 6x9, that 6x9, it wasn't about the number of people that experienced it, it was who experienced it. And anybody who was campaigning around solitary confinement, or any of the sort of the charities and organizations, realized that if you could take that experience to the right places, and you got people to, it could be a very small number of people would have a huge impact. And so I think that's another piece of funding that's beginning to happen.
So just tell me with the business model stuff. So we've got sort of platforms who need the content, and therefore in the short term at least they're going to they're going to pay. You've got foundations, maybe you've got public service organizations that have money and want to develop this way. How do you see the sort of business model and sponsorship, right? Brands also are interested. I mean, where do you see the money coming from in the future?
Well, sponsorship is not touching us that much, but I think...
Is that just because of the way you're set up, or just because it's not available?
We are set up, yeah. But I think we see it a bit more on a larger scale. When we started with it, we knew about maybe 5 companies in Europe familiar with that technology, and now based on all the productions we did, and we're having in production, there's really a landscape which created itself of some 100 companies in Europe working on that. I mean, that's an effect which has to be taken into account in terms of economic business model or something like that. It's quite interesting to see that. But still, financing is a big question. But I think if the distribution of that sort of content is taking pace, and we see interest of VR arcades, of cinemas, licensing some productions we did, then I think we see step by step that there's a kind of market creating itself, which then at the end needs again new content. So,
but it's probably different kinds of things, isn't it? You've got your bigger things, then you've got sort of medium things which brands might want to sponsor, and then you've got sort of news stuff. But Zillah, if you were doing something immersive from Syria or from the refugee camps or whatever, then that's quite hard to sponsor, isn't it? Or it's certainly hard to put ads
that sort
around,
of stuff
isn't
is
it?
probably pretty toxic to brands, I would say. Interesting on the brand-sponsored thing. I mean, there is the usual problem there of convincing brands that about the quality and reach problem. Brands generally want reach, and at the moment, to convince them to sponsor or be involved with VR, you've got to convince them that they will get to fewer people, but far more effectively. And that, I understand, is a sort of big challenge for agencies trying to encourage brands to come on board at the moment.
Yeah. But I think what you said in your report is quite interesting. I mean, to partner with others is essential, and we are just about to publish an experience we did with the New York Times and Al Jazeera together, and that way it worked. Everybody brought something on the table, and at the end we have a compelling experience.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to open it up because there's a lot of people who know a lot about VR in the audience, so we'd love to hear your questions and thoughts. So we've got 2 people with microphones around, so if you have a question for Zillah or for the panel, just put up your hands and we'll get a microphone to you. Who would like to start? Don't be shy. Thank you. Somebody in the middle. It's always the first. And we may get Kasabian quite soon, so just want to remind people of the jeopardy factor out there.
And I can't sing either, so. Looking at VR for content organizations and news organizations is one thing, that's great. But also the process of capturing 360 is coming down through the prices of cameras that can be used. Editing, as I understand it, has been technically described as a pain in the bum. But are we getting anywhere near user-generated content? Obviously, it has a huge influence on news itself, but if there are 360 first-person experiences of news, that's pretty powerful.
Yes, actually, Blick, the Swiss newspaper, are about to do a big, huge UC 360 project, which is sponsored by Samsung, who are handing out cameras, and so they're starting. So we will start to see that, and that will be an interesting one to watch. Because
so what are they using? What cameras?
The little Samsung cameras, right. But that's how they've achieved that, again, through another tech partnership sponsorship thing, but that would be an interesting one to watch to see how effective that is. I think in Switzerland, mountains and things work really well, and they like planes. So there's lots of they're very keen on representing Switzerland and everything good about it in VR. That's one of their things. So I think that's going to be very effective.
But, I mean, presumably that's where we're going to see the tools emerge first, because 360 is kind of simpler, and it's simpler to stitch together and all the rest of it. So
it's the same with the 360 live video.
360 live.
That's which is coming up now, and I think which will may have a huge impact on journalism, to be there really in the moment when it happens.
Has anyone seen any good 360 live yet?
We did one.
I mean, feel free to contribute to this. I'm sceptical, but you know, I might be wrong. Okay, some other questions. I have one on this side and one here.
Jane Ellison from BBC. I worked in radio for many years, and I love this stuff. I think it's fantastic. But I'm very interested in the fact that nobody's really talked about sound. And I think the sound is an intrinsic part of the experience in ways that are actually very different from the traditional way of using sound. So I'd be interested in the panel's views on what VR needs in terms of sound, and secondly, whether there are any spin-offs for the sound and audio industry from the development of this technology.
We're working a lot with binaural sound, and we look into object-based sound, which is a bit more complicated then. But binaural sound really takes in another level, the whole experience, in a sense that you don't need to see that much, but you understand it while listening to it, and that's extremely interesting. And we started to work with it with a Scottish startup, and then they were bought by Facebook. And now we have it for free. So that's where it goes.
But I think sound is actually one of the cases where it's only when people began to really experiment with VR that they began to realize the significance of sound, and how sound is now a really important part of the design of lots of the experiences, and how much of a cue it can be because there's so many of the challenges of where you're meant to look and how you can take people on journeys and how you can use sound in that way. And I think sound is now emerging as having a good time.
They've started the drinks already.
And I think that's why it's interesting that it's not necessarily people who are experienced with video who make the best VR pieces or experiences. It's often different skill sets or different sort of perspectives. And I think so. It's interesting about photojournalism. And I think it's also interesting about people who think about sort of oral design and sound design are actually becoming more important. And somebody did an amazing thing where sound was the basis with they were going back to Stonehenge, when Stonehenge, sort of whenever, hundreds of years ago, and it was the sound that was the centre of it, not the stones, which were actually much the same.
They almost put the images on top afterwards.
Yeah, and I thought that was sort of really fascinating that you started that whole point from how would it be like to sit within stones, with people drumming, etc., rather than what would it look like.
I was going to ask a great question. I was going to ask about the how do you set up then your VR team? So you talk about all these things might be important. Then it's not just traditional video skills. So who do you have in a VR team? You've set one up. You have one. So I mean, what kind of skill do you have? Sound? Where do they sit? How does it work?
Yeah, I mean, it's first hand you need someone who's familiar with telling stories.
Yeah.
And then you need to create a compelling story and to think about, is this worth doing in VR? Is good?
And do most of the people come from a television documentary background?
Not necessarily. Some are having game backgrounds, right. Some from TV, some from films.
Yeah.
Some other sorts of, some more from interactive, all the transmedia, cross-media, whatever, what we had during the last years. Some are having that angle, and then it's just a question how to combine these different
and get
crafts.
These different skills working together in new ways. Anna,
very similar. I mean, I think ours would start with journalists. I mean, but definitely not necessarily video journalists.
Right.
But I mean, I think all of the pieces start with the same sort of principles that any big piece of journalism would start with. And then I think the successful team is one that brings many different skills and perspectives, and that's partly developers, and that's partly about design, and sometimes from very different sort of, whether it's from sort of theatre or really different sort of, I think, kind of viewpoints on how you would build an experience.
And do you have commercial people part of that core team, or do they come in for particular points?
So I think there are commercial people who are attached to the studio, which is actually unusual for The Guardian, because normally there's much more sort of separation. But they're not. I don't think they're really part of the core team, but they're definitely there to try and understand what's being made and developed, and to see how they can translate that back into commercial conversations.
Okay, so we've got time for a few more questions. So we've got one here and then one at the front.
Jane Barrett from Reuters. I'm interested, we've been talking a lot about the sort of the ideas and the people that you need. I'm interested to hear about your expectations or needs in the hardware side of things. We've spoken about how awkward it is to hold a cardboard or sit on a sofa or whatever. What do you see coming down the pike in terms both of the experience and then also in terms of the camera and capturing sound in 360 and the like?
I'm not sure I should answer that.
Well, I mean, we need to start really in the basic questions. 5G will come in some years. A terabyte in the pocket will come in some years. Oh no, we have it already, but to have it on the mobile will come. A gigabit per second connection is already in place in South Korea, but it will come here as well. These are the fundamental questions.
So there's a bandwidth limitation.
The bundle of these questions, and the answers to these questions is fundamental for the whole thing, I think. Especially if you want to bring it to that kind of devices here, smart TVs, where we're working on, and we did already a prototype last year with Fraunhofer in Germany. I mean, that's really can be extremely interesting to show it there. But then at the end, for the user experience, I think the best is the interface should be something like breathing or drinking a glass of water. It needs to be extremely easy. Right now, the good thing is you have a play button, you press play, and it rolls. But you know, all this Google around and stuff like that, that's still a bit.
So I think you were talking a little bit about this in the report, that you know, that the headset itself. I mean, can we get to something more like glasses? So it just doesn't feel like that you have to put something else on. Do you think that will happen?
I hope so. At the moment, it's clunky. It often doesn't quite work. When it doesn't work, you don't know where to start to sort it out. The batteries go down. The upgrades on the phone you're doing. So it's not there's just too many things that can go wrong. If you're persistent and you know what to expect, you can work through those. But if you were just opening this up at home and you weren't a early adopter willing to deal with some of those challenges, it's not good enough yet.
Okay, we had one at the front here.
I just wanted to push you a bit on sort of money and resource to do this. In Zillah's report, you refer, Zillah, to the Berliner Zeitung, I think, Berlin newspaper, which wanted to...
Morgenpost.
Morgenpost, sorry.
Yeah.
Which wanted to sort of separate itself from, you know, to mark itself out for the rest of the market by doing VR. So if you were a relatively, not a huge organization, and you said you want to invest in this, and you want to make some VR content, and you want to have something up and running in the next year, how much, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about partnerships with tech companies and platforms, that's fine, but if we were trying to reach into your own pocket to do this, how much money, how many people, and how long would it take to get some VR content up and running?
I think that's an impossible question, really, because you could do it at the low end and still do something groundbreaking with consumer cameras if you were really ambitious about it. I do think this lesson of do something as creatively ambitious as you can, and then talk about it and make as much of it as you can is the main lesson I'd give to everyone. You almost don't need to make the VR at the moment. You could just about make the trailer and then get everyone excited about that for the time being, because that's what's most important right now is getting people excited about it all for now, and that will probably be the case for a little while until more people have access to the headsets.
But I mean, presumably, so how much does it cost, say, to do something like the your 6x9 cell?
I mean, actually, I don't think 6x9 was that expensive. I think it's much more expensive when you need to work in CGI. And
when we say not that expensive, I mean, you don't have to give the exact number, but I mean, you know, is it 100,000?
No, I don't think it's that much.
Less than that to do.
Yes, less than that.
Okay, I mean, what roughly to do some of the projects that you've done in VR?
It's between 5,000 and 500,000. It's a range.
Yeah. So we're talking like a wide range here.
It's the same like
a big television or a drama or whatever. Yeah. So and going back to sort of advice again, you know, if you're a media company, I guess the question is, should you go into it? And if you should go into it, what's the strategy behind it? What are the range of strategies behind it? And you must have had lots of conversations about this at The Guardian. What would you advise other media companies to do?
Well, I think you probably have to go into it with your eyes wide open, which is if you're going to do it, then it probably is about experimentation at this point, and brand, and being seen to innovate, and credibility within a space. Money. And you probably have to be realistic that you're not going to make a lot of money from it in a year or even 2 years. And you probably have, and I think much the same as I think media companies have to think about Snapchat or something where there's a very distinctive platform, which is you do probably have to put a dedicated group of people on it. I don't think it's about just giving cameras out to everybody and saying make beautiful things, because it won't happen. And so you have to be comfortable that a dedicated team of people is being allowed to experiment and that you can understand what success looks like within that context. Because it's unlikely to be that you're going to sell a lot of branded content deals on the back of it. You might sell some, but...
Yeah. And I mean, it was interesting in the in Zillah's report. What was the name of the organisation that made the recommendation? Not necessarily
DPP.
The DPP, saying maybe you don't need to worry about this. You don't need first mover advantage right now. It's going to take quite a long time. Do you think that's right, or should broadcasters who should be owning the space in many ways be at least experimenting? Do you think?
Depends. I mean, if you want to produce view numbers, 360 video is something you need for Facebook or other kind of platforms. But I think the best is really to look at it in the long term and to do some maybe a smaller number of great productions per year. To be present with it, to be with the wave, so to say. And then also to learn with it, because actually while working on that, you learn a lot about that new media landscape where we are in today. I mean, just some basic questions: how to measure. Is it 2 million views on Facebook more relevant than 500,000 downloads of your app? Or is I don't know, to show it to 300 people in a cinema, but on a regular basis, maybe more interesting than have the views on Facebook? That's really something where you have to put the things a bit in perspective and see, okay, what is then your angle in the sense of these kind of new medium which you can distribute in a really more vaster way than it was possible with other kind of interactive content before. So right now it's really interesting that you learn a lot with it while working on it, not necessarily about the medium, but about the landscape as well.
And I think it is about that recalibrating. It's not about lots of people at this point, but it, I think it's interesting we call them experiences, and it's almost as though you think of them as events. It's not millions of people often, or it's not even thousands of people often, but it could be that the people who experience it in the right context, if you build the right things around it and you create these other things that kind of communicate around what you're doing, that becomes a really important and meanful, success.
And I think for ARTE there was something which was really interesting, because based on that type of content, ARTE is seen really on all continents on the world.
Right.
We had, I don't know how
so
many.
So it's been fantastic marketing for you, right?
Yes,
You've never been as famous.
Now we have viewers in I don't know, a lot of countries in Africa and in South America, wherever. And that's something we shouldn't underestimate.
And I'd just like to say that Notes on Blindness, which ARTE produced, was cited by every single person I interviewed for the report as one of the most inspiring VR pieces they could think of, and I asked them to list them.
And he's in the room.
Well.
Okay, we're going to finish to give you a chance to have a glass of wine. But just finally, technology throws up all these amazing possibilities. 3D TV comes to mind. So if we look back from 5 years' time backwards, what will make or break this opportunity? So, is this... What would have to happen to make this brilliant, and what could go wrong, do you think? Just a sort of final question.
If people don't buy headsets, it's not going to work in 5 years' time.
So a huge amount depends on what happens with those headsets overnight. So that's one of the things that could make or break it. Anna?
I agree that the technology has to evolve to a point where it's I think Amazon Echo is a perfect example of when suddenly it's not. It doesn't. She's not very clever, but she's very easy to set up.
Absolutely.
Suddenly it's seamless, and so you can. So I think you do have to get to a point where people want to buy them. They're very easy to use. The experience is actually sort of comfortable and enjoyable, and you mustn't have killed the excitement along the way by too much disappointing content.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, we did Polar Sea 5 years ago, and I wouldn't have thought that we're arriving here today with I don't know how many goggles are on the market right now, maybe something like 20, 25-ish. With I don't know how many different platforms are having 360 players,
Yep.
Facebook, Google, YouTube, I don't know.
So it's exceeded,
hard to count it.
your imagination from 5 years before.
It was really unimaginable that it was moving that fast forward. So in 5 years, I think we will talk about still immersive content in a way that has maybe its roots in cinema and its roots in these things we're working on today, but how it will look like, no one knows.
Good point to finish on. Thank you very much to our panel and to Zillah. Thanks to Anna, thanks to Kay, and thanks particularly for Zillah for a fantastic report. Do download it, and thank you very much for coming. Do share a glass of wine.